Hey, Miguel Iturrate back here on the CRP, and the Cage Rage podcast is going to do one of our long podcasts here today, and we're going to delve into one of our favorite subjects, MMA history. I'm joined by my sidekick here on the MMA scene, Devin Miller. Dev, we're going to delve into the deep past here and talk a little bit about the Pride organization and its place in history. I guess at some point the UFC purchased Pride and put it on the shelf, but there was a time where it was the biggest show on the planet. So I'll let you take it from there. What do you think? We're going to hit Pride. That's a lot of fun in my book.
Yeah, I've been really excited about this series, Miguel, because it's going to take us several episodes, probably reaching close to probably a dozen, to adequately cover
Well,
what is such a just a foundational chunk of MMA's history up to this point. We're about 3 or 4 decades in, if you count the 80s and you count the early Valley Tudo days, that we're going to talk a lot about today. And MMA short ride really was such a foundational time period uh, for MMA short history, and really we haven't seen anything quite as big. We never saw anything quite as big before, quite as big after, and we're going to talk a lot about Pride 1 today, in particular Rickson Gracie and his fight with Japanese professional wrestling legend Nobuhiko Takada. And I'm looking forward to this conversation.
yeah, I I agree with you. Now, I it's not fair to say I think that we haven't seen anything as big, and I think that when you consider the fact that the UFC's filled up stadiums and they've done 4 million pay-per-views and stuff like that, that you really can't say that the UFC has an eclipse them at this point. But back in the day, and even during Zuffa's time in the early part of the Zuffa reign with the UFC, Pride was the biggest show on the planet. You can go back to the early days of UFC with Bob Meyerowitz, and I can give you clear examples of fighters that may have had an offer from Pride and from the UFC, and during those occasions they were selecting Pride, and Pride was where they were getting paid more money, and it was definitely the first show of the international style. On top of that, and I think what is missing is that spectacle aspect of, like, getting 7 foot Korean wrestlers and 7 foot Brazilian pro wrestlers, and Takada came from the pro wrestling world. Later on, they would use Ogawa, and they weren't shy about doing gimmick type of fights, and um, that's absent now, at least to the extent that they did. The UFC sometimes gets accused of taking their gimmick fights too far, right? And wait till we get into some of the Pride gimmick fights. Have some fun there.
Yeah, the reason I said that about we haven't really seen something quite as big is because sometimes we forget that, when it comes to Pride 1, the topic of today's convo, this was really MMA's first mega show. It was the first time that some serious big money was clearly behind a MMA promotion in Japan, and behind every idea to make it big is some big capital. And in this first show for Tokyo, place October 11th, 1997, and there was officially 47,860 people in attendance, and that's really amazing. I mean, it's what we just saw at WrestleMania this past week. A little over half of what we saw at WrestleMania this week, and look how big that crowd was. I mean, they were packing out Japan's biggest stadium for this event, and they had the perfect matchup to headline it, and Gracie and Takada, and I wanted to kind of go into a little bit of a backdrop of what this fight was, because this took place in 1997, and both these guys had a pretty significant history behind them going into this fight. You had Rickson Gracie, who at this time was 39 years old, and I live in America where the UFC is like synonymous with MMA. When people think MMA, they think the UFC. So because of that, here in the States, the name Hoist is a lot more recognizable than the name Rickson when it comes to Gracie's. But that's not how it really is, even within the family. Rickson Gracie was always the main Gracie, the main staple of the Gracies, and there's a lot of legends up of 400 fights and was undefeated in all of them, and that's including street fights, gym fights, beach fights, and this is even a record that's even somewhat admittedly exaggerated even by the family themselves. That could be a little exaggerated, but the idea, I think, is just that he fought a lot and never lost. He was just running through everybody, and this was mainly because they were ahead of the game. They knew something that everybody else that was competing in Vale Tudo and MMA at the time that they didn't know. All other grapplers were basically playing chess while the Gracies were playing checkers while the Gracies were playing chess. Their grappling was just so far ahead of the rest of them, and he was a legend of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and he was of the family. You there, Miguel?
Yep. I'm sorry, I didn't know if you had cut out there a little bit, but no, I agree with a lot of what you said in the assessment there. I think now you're getting into the early days of the Gracie legend, right? And I think that in the early days, the Gracies themselves, and that being really Horion more than anybody else, they made business decisions at this point. They've gotten access in the United States to Bob Meyerowitz, and they made a deal to get the UFC 1 on pay-per-view. And, that was seminal. That was going to be historic, and that was going to lead to everything that we see now in MMA. So that would be the single biggest act there. And you're right that they selected Hoist there. Meanwhile, Rickson went to Japan, and the reason for that is because they made more money in Japan, and Rickson was more of a respected fighter, in the pecking order of the Gracie, so he was going to get to pick the spot kind of thing. In terms of Pride, the bottom line is Rickson had already performed in Japan considerably before the Pride fight, and this was a comeback, So in the same terms as when Hoist Gracie won UFC 1 and then won UFC 2 and, bowed out of UFC 3, came back, that sort of stuff, that's his early history. Rickson won 2 Vale Tudo Japan tournaments, exactly the same format. They were in a ring, but they were, 3 fights in one night sort of stuff, and he'd done it twice in 94 and 95. And by virtue of those, then he took 2.5 years off. And it was like, what's it going to take for him to come back? And the opponent, Takada, comes from the pro wrestling world. But that becomes, a little window into what you're looking at in Japan and what leads to Pride. Now, Japan already had sophisticated MMA groups at this time. And by sophisticated, I mean much more advanced in terms of fighting and even fighting level than the UFC. And by those two, I mean Pancrase, and you can tell Pancrase was of a certain level because so many of the early UFC fighters come with Pancrase experience because it definitely was applicable, Even through the UFC's 18 and 19 and stuff, we were still seeing Bas Rutten debut and people like that. And those were, Bas Rutten held the UFC title. So there's no doubt that, Pancrase with the Shamrocks and, even mid-card fighters like a Jason DeLucia, Evan Tanner came from there. Chris Lytle spent time in Pancrase. Chris Lytle is still fighting, a few years back. So he was a baby back then. But Pancrase was definitely an organization that was sophisticated. But they didn't have big money. And they also had a fractured reputation in that some of their fights didn't have predetermined outcomes at some point. Some of their athletes and stuff, were there to put over other athletes, and the way they build things up had a little bit of a distinct influence from pro wrestling. So that was Pancrase, and Rings was even more pro wrestling. It's from the Rings and the Takada that Takada comes from the Rings influences, and the Rings was even more prone towards predetermined outcomes at one point in their careers, but they also had top athletes. Frank Shamrock fought in Rings. At a later date when Rings was trying to establish their legitimacy, you had, Randy Couture fought Jeremy Horn in Rings. I mean, if you go way back, so Rings had a place too, but Rings definitely had a little bit of a tainted reputation. Also, they had, some real different rules at times in terms of standing up people and things like, and where you can hit people and stuff. So Rings kind of was more of a pro wrestling stand. Then you had Shudo in Japan, which was the purists, and they still are. And I respect Shudo, and we worked with Shudo at some point when both groups started to get a little bit bigger, and they were always very much, oriented towards the sport first and not the gimmick type of things that would come with Pride. So what happens with Pride is now you've got a big money backer. You're looking at the landscape of how do you bring Rickson Gracie back? And you've got to find an opponent. And that opponent has to be somebody that is going to fill that stadium and make the payment. The word is Rickson was given $5 million to come back. And, with that in mind, even if it was $1 million at the time or whatever, the promoter was going to need a real opponent in terms of interest. And the fact that Takada was never going to be a real threat to a guy like Gracie, doesn't really come into it, because what they did is they got a crossover audience and they got most of the Japanese public involved in watching the fight. Rickson, the Gracie name does have that legendary reputation. It carries in Japan, and here was, the most effective money grab that they had. And I call it a money grab, but they make the offer and present the opponent, and you say yes. Rickson has made a career later out of saying no to other comebacks, but in this particular case, it was considered a comeback. Takada was considered, the biggest name opponent. And Takada's a good athlete from pro wrestling. He basically trained a little bit for this. Later on, Pride would do what is, a work fight basically between Takada and Mark Coleman. So you had Coleman being the UFC's, head honcho later on down the line, and in order to give Takada some legitimacy, he was paid to come in and do a sit down match for him. Or at least that's the strong rumors in the business. You know what I mean? And if you look at the fight and then you look at it afterwards, one of the things that Pride would have had to promise Coleman in order to do that and to give up an undefeated record aside from some money, is the promise of another opportunity. And it's after that a very determined Mark Coleman won the Pride GP, which many consider, still the high point of that legendary career, So very interesting things. And that all plays into, Takada and when you walk into Pride 1, Takada's untainted. He's 0-0 in MMA. So you didn't need the Coleman pop until afterwards, where, I think he retired with a losing record, right? So it's not like, Takada was going to be an impactful MMA fighter rather. He was going to be a draw, though, and that's what you had there. It was a fight to be a draw, and the rest of the card around it was, for the time put together, you could see some thought winning every fight.
Yeah, you covered a lot of ground there, but Rickson definitely was brought in as the martial arts mystic legend, and Takada was brought in as the spectacle. And I think it's important to note that even in the scripted pro wrestling Japanese scene, that these pro wrestlers were expected to actually be real tough guys, and they had a history of challenging and fighting legit competitors. I mean, obviously the most notable example of that is Muhammad Ali and Inoki fighting, and in this case, a pair of big names here with the spectacle with Takada and the legend of Rickson. It drew 48,000 in attendance and was a perfect marketing. Perfect fight to market the inaugural Pride event. Going to Rickson Gracie's, just his background leading up into this, as we've mentioned, this was right after, this was just 3 or 4 years after Royce took the American market by storm by coming in UFC. Also, there was one of the most famous MMA documentaries came out in 1995 called Choke, which was mainly centered around Rickson Gracie and the Gracie family. And Rickson Gracie dates back even before his tournaments, his Vale Tudo tournaments in Japan. He was a legend down in Brazil dating back into the early 80s. He actually had his first Vale Tudo MMA fight in 1980 when he had his legendary rivalry with Ray Zulu. And he actually ended up, the rematch of that in '84 actually ended up on the undercard of a very popular Brazilian boxer at the time. And so Rickson had been around a long time and apparently had a lot of challenges that they would invite to their gym and that they would fight in there. And as I mentioned earlier, he got this reputation of having 400 some fights, and he was a freak athlete also. Unlike Royce was much less of a physically imposing figure than Rickson was. But Rickson had definitely this unbeatable mystique around him at the time, and a lot of it was because of his level of jiu-jitsu was on such a different level than everybody else, and nobody really even knew what they were doing. And you brought up Pancrase, you brought up the Union of Wrestling Forces and New Japan Wrestling and all these different organizations that were in the background, Shudo, and that was something that with Takada is he popularized the whole shoot style of fighting. And you brought up the controversy with match fixing that was was hanging over the first Pride event that a lot of people were worried about. And he also went on to be a very successful actor. So he was the perfect person to bring in for Rickson, that was going to bring the crowd, that was well known. And Rickson was the perfect person to have this legendary status to go against the spectacle that was Takada.
Yeah, look, I've been to Japan many times around the fight game, and it's very interesting the way they appeal to the public. It very much does have a superhero feel to the public with the fighters and things like that. And nobody captures that like Rickson Gracie. Well, I don't want to say nobody. There have been instances of other athletes that capture that mystique, but when you consider Rickson, who's a normal-sized dude, at the end of the day, he's not like Bob Sapp. Like Bob Sapp had that magic for 6 months, right? So, but Rickson had that mystique, and it was because his martial arts were pure, the way that you described them. And what that does is that crosses over in Japan. That's their world. They consider themselves, the home of martial arts. And let me just correct one thing. In Japan, the pro wrestling is different than in the United States, where in the United States, it has, even in the United States, I think, you'd be foolish to think the guys aren't tough, especially in what they get put through. And in Japan, the lines between what pro wrestling is and what catch wrestling or shoot wrestling is are even a little bit more blurry at times, especially made that way by Pancrase and stuff. That's why Shu doesn't like them much, because it does muddy the waters and confuse people over what's real and what's not. But keep in mind, you've got guys like Josh Barnett, who always said, I practice catch wrestling, or catch can, or whatever you want to call it. And then there is the idea of shoot. The shoot is a pro wrestling match without a predetermined outcome. That's what that word means in the parlance of wrestling. So in Japan, those dudes were tough, and they were practicing at times moves that would be a hook. If I can, use my old partner Jeff Osborne's term of hook and shoot, that comes from a hook is a move that will fuck you up, in terms of in pro wrestling. So you have the move and then the shoot being an unpredetermined outcome. That's where the name hook and shoot comes from. But all these types of things, the Japanese were the most advanced at practicing it and looking at it as something where, yeah, we can compete without a determined outcome. The American guys don't try that. In Japan, they are far out there enough and respected enough that they did. Obviously, there's an edginess to it that shows, and that they have a hard time competing against a real fighter guy. But it was definitely worth the show, and it paid the bills at the time. In terms of, if you're going to pay Rickson Gracie what he wants to come back, you're going to need somebody to step up, and Takada was that guy. Shortly afterwards from that gym emerged a guy that would break the mold for all of this, and really change things, and really put the sport on its head, and that's Sakuraba, because Sakuraba came from this world where he would, describe Takada as a teacher of him. And then you watch Sakuraba fight MMA, you watch Takada fight MMA, and you'd be like, how could that guy have taught that guy?
Yeah.
There's no correlation. Sakuraba was an advanced machine for the time he came from. But don't ever forget that he came from this pro wrestling world.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead, because that was my idea for the second installment of this series, was to go on to Sakuraba, because that's really where Pride did take off. But you did mention all the different grappling styles that was coming around at the time. We've seen that in the UFC with guys like Shamrock and other grapplers that fought Hoist in the early days, and we've seen that in Pride, where you had Sambo, you had Judo, you had the catch wrestling, you had all these different styles, the shoot style of grappling. And that's why I brought up earlier about how the Gracies with their jiu-jitsu were playing checkers while everybody else was playing chess. I mean, they were playing chess while everybody else was playing checkers. I read once it described it. I thought it was described succinctly that all these other grapplers were trying to make a flame by rubbing two sticks together, while the Gracies were just bona fide flamethrowers at the time. I mean, they had such a more diverse set of skills behind them, and that's why they were always catching guys. They had so many different techniques, and anybody who's familiar with any form of submission grappling understands that diversity of techniques from different positions. Eventually, it's gonna wear you out. Your defense is you're gonna get caught, and they were just masters at surviving that at the time, before the sport evolved and actually was able to understand their system better and learn to defeat them. But what the Gracies gave us, what Rickson gave us, and what Hoist gave us, and what the other ones gave us, just that really built the foundation of martial arts, is until people started to learn to have some sort of troubleshooting and some sort of defense built in to that system of grappling, they couldn't compete. They couldn't beat them. And that's when we really started to see the evolution, and guys like Sakuraba come along, who that style no longer was just always going to catch them. They were able to get in there against guys. They ended up getting in there against guys that had done their homework, had studied their system long enough to where they were able to compete and eventually beat them. And that's when we ended up getting Sakuraba, the Gracie Hunter. But until people were able to do that with the Gracies, that's why the Gracies were such pioneers of the sport, because they were until people really figured out their system, no one could even compete. And that's really saying something, that where it's not possible to overestimate their worth in laying the foundation for MMA, because jiu-jitsu was really that much of a foundation to the sport.
Yeah, I think you're right. The family, led by Rickson, and Rickson's the theme, obviously, of the podcast, but the family definitely was the right marketing mechanism for the sport. They needed something deep and powerful to show what they knew was already deep and powerful. But how do you do that? Well, You know, you uniquely now have a family here that keeps it all in the family and has generations worth of history already, and where they don't have any history or real legit anything to back it up, they mix it in there with a good bit of mystique and stuff like that, right? Basically, to me, what jujitsu does is, you know, and you're talking about jujitsu with the gi. It's a very it's extreme discipline to get to be a black belt, especially at the level of these guys. So immediately you have to take it upon that. But somewhere in what Brazilian jiu-jitsu did, and maybe it has to do with the Brazilian culture and stuff, but it became extremely efficient. And what happens there is that there is a life or death type of attitude almost in the guys when they were coming up in their hunger. And I can give you a very American example of this. People want to go back and look at tape. We've been talking about Frank Shamrock, who came from Pancrase, and Pancrase, like I said, but it was open hand punching. You know, you can't say that open. It was open hand strikes. You can't punch. And though you know there are knockout blows that can be landed, and the competition in Pancrase was amazingly compelling because they had great athletes and stuff, there was that feeling that it was a notch below MMA in danger or anything like that. But you had Frank Shamrock, who was one of the elite guys there. And when you look at Frank Shamrock's MMA debut, he got beat up by John Lober. And John Lober was, you know, a guy who had a certain level at the time and stuff like that. But what Lober had over Frank in that fight was that Lober took it like a street fight, took it like a life and death. And Frank was in there trying to compete. Hey, this is cool, new rules, you know. And it was that same Pancrase mentality of, you know, he didn't realize he was about to get beat up. And he got beat up. And then when you turn it around, their rematch headline UFC Brazil many years later, and Frank was a whole different animal. And Frank turned the tables around and showed Lober, hey, you know, I am better and I'm going to beat you up. And he did beat him up. And the difference there was more mindset and mentality. And I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and growing up in that culture at that time and stuff, and very much, you know, that mindset comes to you from your, you know, from your teachers too. They had the idea of teaching the mind to be, you know, in a life and death situation. That made a lot of difference for what the Jiu-Jitsu does, you know. But the Lober Shamrock is a very good example of why MMA, once you get into MMA, is different. I've seen Ken Shamrock have this discussion with people where he'll actually say MMA is not a sport. I don't know if he's changed his tune in the last few years, but the last time I've seen and been around Ken when he had that discussion, he would argue that it's not a sport, that edginess takes the sportive aspect away from it, and there is that you better not let a guy off the hook. So the Gracies embodied that. That was something that they brought with them. I'm not saying it's theirs because other fighters and other systems bring forth that mentality, that hard nose, but that was the first time you saw it at that level of really almost taking it, you know, taking a sport and making it life and death. And I think that was, you know, a great deal. Yeah, I think Henzo was almost more of a guy that showed it because he was much more emotional when he fought. Rickson was always the quiet warrior, you know.
Yeah, and just moving on here a little bit about just Pride 1 and just the beginning of Pride. As we covered, there was a lot of money that went into Pride 1, and Rickson Gracie was the main attraction. What we see with Pride 1 from there on out, and what we've heard from guys like you mentioned, Renzo Gracie. I mean, I remember on Pride Fighting Decade documentary, him talking about like this was now the model. After round one, after Pride 1, that was now the model of what MMA, high level MMA is going to look like going forward. High level MMA production. They raised the bar so much, just right off their first event, of how big a big MMA show is supposed to look like. And I mean, I do think the UFC has clearly been more stable, more consistent and stuff, but I'm not sure we've ever seen events as big as what some of the main Pride events were. And Pride 1 really set everything off and was just a massive event, 48,000 people. And they had a huge market there in Japan. It was a very brilliant strategy from a lot of people there the money that came in. They set up a perfect event, and they really just raised the bar for what MMA was going to look like going forward.
Yeah, and if you look at what they did, going through, match by match, in Japan, obviously, you're going to need Japanese stars, right? And you're going to need Japanese fighters. And at this point, because it's such the early days, and because you're concentrating and they're concentrating on doing, heavyweight type of fights, they didn't use Shudo fighters. They didn't use a lot of Japanese talent. They actually kept a very spare show and only had, like 6 or 7 fights on there. A couple of them were UFC ripoffs, where they actually went out and made fights that really should have happened in the UFC or could have happened in the UFC, such as Kimo and Severn, and then Goodridge and Taktarov. Those were fights, with athletes from the UFC. Aside from that, Koji Kitao, Japanese fighter with a sumo background, he fought Nathan Jones. Nathan Jones never did MMA afterwards. I think he came from Australia or something like that. But then you had Renzo Gracie and Akira Shoji. That's a hardcore fight because Shoji at the time was, coming up, and Shoji's a serious martial artist. A lot of people may disrespect him because he kind of got to be like the butterball guy and stuff like that. But Shoji was a very serious martial artist, and this fight he extended Renzo Gracie to a draw. So, a very interesting character to me, Shoji. Then the other Japanese guy that was on the card that they were bringing along was Kazunari Murakami, and he fought John Dixon. Dixon being a recycle from the early days of UFC, and Murakami was a guy that had a couple of moments where he lost to Maurice Smith, I believe. I'm going to go back and look at this just so I'm sure of what we're talking about. But yeah, he came up in the early days in the Lumex Cup, which was another interesting videotape I used to get from Japan with the Lumex Cups that I used to trade for. And those were very, they'd wear the gi and stuff, but there was striking with the gi and very tough stuff, And if you look at it, Akihiro Gono, these are guys that were still, are still around just a couple of years ago that took place there. So he came up through the Lumex Cups, and then by the time, Murakami was fighting John Dixon in Pride 1, he had already been in the United States and fought, and he knocked out Bart Vale. And Bart Vale, if you look at this Extreme Fighting Championship, that was John Peretti's show, definitely an underrated show. Bart Vale was a guy with a shoe fighting reputation, a tough guy. He had knocked out Ken Shamrock and was is a worked fight. So, but, there was the reputation and the rumors and stuff, a big, huge dude. He fought in that tournament, he fought a guy named Mike Bitonio. Mike Bitonio passed away, so may he rest in peace. And Mike Bitonio, man, again, this dude is a guy, I don't even think he fought much more after that and stuff like that. But if you want to look at an early, raw MMA fight, watch Bart Vale and Mike Bitonio. So after you see that fight, for Murakami Kazunari to come in and knock out Bart Vale, he was an instant legend in Japan. And after that, he lost to Maurice Smith. And there's, no shame in losing to Maurice Smith, who was on his way to be a legend himself, So here he comes into Pride, and he gets an easy job. John Dixon, with all due respect, the type of martial artist that showed up at UFC 1 wearing a sweatshirt, So definitely from a different time. And, he got the gig, he took it, and Kazunari won from there. He didn't do much afterwards in his career, but you could see, they were trying to put together MMA-oriented fights by bringing in all that UFC talent, getting as many Japanese guys in there as possible. Like I said, a 6-fight card, actually not much by our standards now, but 48,000 people there and just, crazy, crazy anticipation for the fight of Rickson and Gracie. So many, because Rickson last fought, just a couple of years back. He'd been off for 2.5 years. But in those 2.5 years, MMA had grown. Not like the UFC growth of now, but MMA had grown where there was more attention, and there were people who hadn't seen those Vale Tudo Japans, and they were all dying to see Rickson and Gracie. So, that's the Pride 1 popped up.
I agree. Pride came in at the exact right time. That was riding a wave of new popularity that was being groomed in smaller promotions across Japan. The Brazilian market was already established, and America was starting to get their market developed, so MMA was growing globally. It was getting well known, and I think it's important to note before we sign off that Rickson did obviously win the main event. He was brought in to win. He was almost guaranteed to win this. The spectacle, as we mentioned, was really brought in by Takada, and then actually Rickson's only other fight in Pride was a rematch with Takada at Pride 4, and he submitted him there also, both times within 10 minutes. Pride had a 10-minute first round that was definitely different than what we see in the UFC, which in the early days the UFC didn't even have a time limit. And then, but Rickson got it done both times in Pride against Takada. Pride 1, for any MMA fan today that goes back and tries to watch Pride 1, I mean, it wasn't the most eventful, spectacular, exciting event, but nothing can compare to really what it did to really show a new level of promotion in the sport of MMA. And it really just set the ball rolling to a history that is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, is really foundational to understanding the history of MMA, is to really look at Pride and look at what all they did, and just, you can't begin a conversation about the history of Pride without just looking where it began and really looking at the key figure, which was Rickson Gracie. He really was the first big name. He was Pride at the beginning, and Takada was the perfect, as you said, he was the perfect person to bring in as a money grab, and that's really what all Pride 1 really was. It was a big money grab. I like the way you put that. It was a spectacle, but it got people interested in this sport, MMA, at a much grander stage, and it paid off to be very lucrative for the money that was for the investors that were behind it, that put the capital up to throw such a big event at the Tokyo Dome, and it led to just even bigger events in the future that we're going to get into cover on later episodes of this series.
Yeah, and I mean, getting into where they would go from there, the thing that was interesting about Pride, and we had a couple of events in the United States, and if you look back at it, there were a couple of historic events that came out with a lot of steam, and then they wound up being events that only did one show. The promoters didn't have the legs, or they eventually didn't see the return of a sport that was still a fringe sport, so they never returned. And a good example of that was a show called Mars. If you look back at a show called Mars, Mars was where Tom Erickson made his debut, an American wrestler who, at some point may have been the biggest, toughest guy on the planet. 280, 290. He had a legendary fight with Murillo Bustamante, where Bustamante really, 100 pounds lighter kind of thing, showed the value of jiu-jitsu in a way that, was definitely stunning and definitely, but that show never returned. There was a show called WEC, I think, where Matt Rimland may have made his debut, and there were a couple of guys like that, and actually where they had a maybe not worked fight with Gokor Chivichian. So, there were definitely American shows in the early days that pretended to be big. If I remember that show, that one was backed by it doesn't matter. There were other instances for the show where Renzo Gracie won an 8-man tournament that he fought James Waring in the final. That show was a one-time show that never fought again. In Japan, you had Pentagon Combat and a few big events that popped up with big fights and big payouts and stuff, and then they never repeated. So Pride came out, and then for Pride 2, they pulled out all the stops again. Not topped it, because you can't really top Rickson Gracie, but definitely added. Sakuraba was on Pride 2. They headlined with Mark Kerr, and I mean, when you talk about Mark Kerr, you're talking about a forgotten guy, a guy who, like, you look at the end of his career, definitely is a guy who's going to be a cautionary tale rather than a Hall of Famer, and that's sad, because when he started out, there was nobody that impressive. He was Mark Coleman 2.0, and that's what Pride debuted in Pride 2 as their headline fight. So they were definitely thinking big the whole time. There
That
they
the
Mark
the
on that card, Zakharova, like I said, Hoyler Gracie.
Yeah, the Smashing Machine documentary, I'm pretty sure came out right around the same time as Choke did. The documentary on Rickson, didn't it?
Well, I think I don't know when the Smashing Machine came out, but the Smashing Machine will be a good one for people if you want to see, like I said, how things can go wrong for an athlete. The Smashing Machine gives you a little bit of an inkling into Mark Kerr and the decline there, and it's really sad. I know Mark, from those days. He competed in the Abu Dhabis many times, and I was there for every time he competed there, and he used to call me Miguel by name. So I mean, I know the guy, and watching him go down, and publicly, I respect him for doing it publicly and allowing people to see that weakness in his life. But it was true. But let me tell you again, just of all the guys that were just, he may be the single most impressive. Like, walk in the room and just be like, "Holy shit!" Guy that I saw from the early days. Because when he was on top of his game, there was nobody. There was nobody I remember that was that scary, that confident, and that advanced because his athleticism really led him to do. Coleman was very much a stock fight that you can expect him, but Kerr was a guy who had evolved into throwing knees and using real, striking that went beyond punching. So that was Pride too. I guess we'll talk about that next time, right? I got a lot of more curse
Yeah, I think we'll get into on the next episode. We'll get into a lot of about Mark Kerr and and his downfall. Which anybody, I think those are two documentaries that we mentioned in this podcast that I think are foundational for any MMA fan that really wants to understand the sport is to go watch Choke and go watch the Smashing Machine. But we'll also get into Sakharov, and when we see what those two guys, I think, was the evolution, the beginning of the evolution in Pride past the Gracies.
Yeah.
And I think that we see that in Pride quicker than we did in America in the UFC, mainly because the UFC got so blackballed in the States when it went through like the dark years, and a lot of people, MMA was a lot harder to see. There was such a big while America was trying to ban mixed martial arts and put it in the dark, Japan was putting it out to where it was almost as big as WrestleMania is in the States over there. So they were getting a lot of eyeballs. But Sakuraba and Mark Kerr, you saw Mark Kerr kind of laid the foundation for future fighters like Tito Ortiz and other of these heavy wrestlers who were mixing in some stand-up skills and were able to defend jiu-jitsu and punish people on the mat. We saw that really resonating in guys like Randy Couture and Tito Ortiz and Fedor and all this. And Sakuraba showed a lot of similar things about defending jiu-jitsu, mixing up different techniques, being able to play with that style. And that was just really the evolution of the sport that came in with guys like that, because now we're starting to reach a different era. Like Rickson Gracie, Hoist Gracie in the UFC, Rickson Gracie in Pride. That was like the pioneer stage. When we start getting into Kerr and Sakuraba, and then we get up into like Nogueira and stuff. Now we're getting into like the early greats, like the early great mixed martial artists who were actual legit mixed martial artists. Because that wasn't the Gracies. The Gracies were specialists. They were pioneers that led really to MMA. To call them an MMA fighter, I don't know how you feel. I don't want to insult the Gracies because I think that their contribution to mixed martial arts is just undeniable, and it's really impossible to over exaggerate, as I said earlier. But they weren't really mixed martial arts fighters. What they did was lead to mixed martial arts fighters, because people had to crack that code of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu before they were even able to compete in mixed martial arts, because Jiu-Jitsu was just that effective. And we start seeing that type of fighter developing with the Mark Kerrs and the Kazuichi Sakurabas after the Gracies and after Rickson in particular.
Yeah, I don't think that's disrespectful. I think that's accurate. I mean, the bottom line is that the Gracies prefer to fight their fights in gis, and that's not a mixed martial artist. So again, without disrespect, you're absolutely right. They are the pioneers. They are the first brick. And once you're starting to talk about Sakuraba and Kerr, you're talking about 2.0s. And that'll be a good subject for the next time. One other quick shout out, since we talked a little bit about documentaries, and you mentioned Choke, and you mentioned
The
the
Smash Machine.
Smashing Machine. There were two other ones that maybe you probably heard them, but if not, for the people out there that they're worth watching too. They're for the Gracies, and they're called the Gracie In Action, and it's Gracie In Action 1 and Gracie In Action 2, and they're basically very much jujitsu infomercials. But what makes them very unique and interesting to find to see is that I think Gracie in Action One has three jujitsu fighters fighting luta livre guys in the '80s in a ring in Brazil, and they include like Murilo Bustamante and a few of the guys that later would become what we recognize as the first wave of jujitsu black belts. And those in action tapes are very much must see viewing. They're out there, and I don't know if maybe the people are familiar with them, and I'm just talking about it, or if they're really have become dark ages. But I remember seeing, getting those tapes, receiving the VHS tape in the mail, and putting them in and seeing it, and really for the first time you get to see, they showed Rickson. It's terrible footage, but they showed Rickson's fight with Hugo Duarte on the beach in Brazil on those tapes. So it's like you start to get first tastes of the legend, and you get the rudeness of Brazil, and by rudeness I mean the street rudeness and stuff that led to these guys and stuff. So if you're gonna look up documentaries, you might as well add In Action One and In Action Two to your list there.
Yep, and actually, I think I got a pretty good idea for when we get this saved and when we get this uploaded onto YouTube. We'll leave in the show links a link to, like I just pulled up on Amazon. You can buy both Volume 1 and 2 of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in Action for only, you can buy used for $6.35 or new for $14. And we'll leave also a link to the documentary Choke, the documentary The Smashing Machine, and maybe even a link to buy Pride 1 on DVD. And I'm pretty sure you could probably stream a lot of that online through Amazon or through Google Play and stuff. I'm pretty sure it's probably all on there. And for anybody who's watching this and wants to get more of a visual for what a lot of this, what we're talking about, I think that those are good sources that we brought up on this podcast, as those are great early documentaries on the early state of MMA. And a lot of people in the States are very familiar with the early UFCs and that footage and stuff, but getting to know Hicks and Gracie, you can probably find a lot of this stuff on YouTube too, but I would definitely recommend those sources. And I'm glad that we covered this to start out, because there was no other place to go to start out when talking about Pride. I mean, when we cover the money that was behind it, the 48,000 people at the Tokyo Dome, when we cover, the whole format of mixed martial arts and what it was, the style versus style and the blending of styles and the new sport, all this, but there's always this, how did we get there type of question behind all of it. And it's always one famous last name that's behind it on the two biggest promotions that the MMA world's ever seen, and that name is Gracie. And they laid the foundation. And Hicks and Gracie, even more than Hoist, who's mainly known in the UFC, is really who brought a whole new level of attention and promotion to the world of mixed martial arts. And he really is the first. He is the king of the pioneers of MMA.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Gracie family. I respect them. I got a chance to work with almost, I believe, all of them at some point or another. At times just when they may have been cornering a fighter on my event or whatever. But I can say, without a doubt that they would never have gotten as far, and the legend would never have gotten that as far if there wasn't some real true depth to what it is that they were trying to sell. Yeah, there's some, smoke and mirrors and stuff, and there's maybe too many people using the Gracie name now. But when you're talking about this era and the Sons of Helio and stuff, they were all the real deal.
Absolutely. And I look forward to this next episode that we're going to cover some stuff on Sakuraba is mainly what we're going to focus on because it was really Pride's first megastar that wasn't just for a couple spectacle fights with a former pro wrestler. This was a guy who legitimately went in and fought and won fights over guys like Quentin Jackson and the Gracies and Vanderlei Silva, and he's still to this day is one of the real legends of MMA. And without him, Pride maybe would have never got the foothold that it had that brought us bigger fighters in the future like Vanderlei and Fedor and Rampage and all that. Like Sakuraba is really what held Pride and made it just consistently a huge promotion because he was that face of the promotion going forward. And we'll cover that in our next episodes.
You're in Japan. Shouldn't be any surprise that you need a Japanese star. And in the case of Sakuraba, you had a guy who could operate with the MMA people of that era. Whereas if you're taking Shudo stars like Ruben Asado or anything like that, then all the weight classes and things would have had to come into place a lot faster, and they weren't there yet. So Sakuraba was special because of his size and because he could operate with those guys. And if you want to do some homework in advance, I remember for myself, when he beat up Vito Belfort and the way he did it, that fight's a lesson. And so that one's one worth watching. And you have to understand at that point, you're talking about a pretty elite Vito Belfort. He's still a relatively young man and stuff. And, he's still figuring out the mind part of it. And Sakuraba used that to win there. But, you're talking about a true legend coming up here in Pride 2. Pride 1, open the door, and hopefully, we'll follow up with a strong podcast for Pride 2.
Looking forward to it.
All right, bro. I'm going to end the broadcast. Thank you very much for listening. If you please subscribe, do all that stuff. Support the site there with some of that stuff. We're going to try to bring you more of this. And, Devin Miller, Miguel Iturrate for the CRP, MMA history, one of our favorite subjects, untapped still.